Growing up in Chicago, I've always had Mexican friends. My two best friends, Kenny and Wolfie, are from Mexico or of Mexican descent. My parents always took me to Mexican restaurants when I was a kid, and some of my family members also married into Mexican families. In Chicago, Mexican culture, food, and people are pretty much omnipresent. Go to the Pilsen neighborhood and you'll find Mexican murals everywhere. Go to Little Village, or La Villita as it's lovingly called, and you'll find huge commerce that is driven by the Mexican community and is second in profit revenue only to Michigan Avenue in downtown Chicago. Go to Ebony Park and you'll find a plethora of Mexican restaurants, including my personal favorite, Taqueria Morelia. But why are there so many Mexicans in Chicago? And how? It makes sense for states like California, Texas, and New Mexico to have big Mexican communities. They are border states, after all, and were part of Mexico before the U.S. annexed these states after the Mexican-American War, which lasted from 1846 to 1848. But Chicago is over 1,500 miles away from the Mexican border. Why would Mexicans make such a long trip from their home country to make a life in a place that's so far away, and with horrible winters on top of it? The answer to these questions is complex, but makes sense once you put all the historical pieces together. Starting from the very beginning, Mexicans have been coming to Chicago since at least the 1850s, in small numbers that were mainly Mexican dignitaries or members of nobility. Though they are small in number, this challenges the notion that Mexicans didn't come to Chicago until the 1910s. The aftermath of the Mexican-American War was a massive change in borders for Mexico. What was known as La Frontera was born. La Frontera was a term used to describe the new border between Mexico and the U.S. after the Mexican-American War. For a while, La Frontera operated as its own unofficial nation, while both Mexicans and Americans figured out how to navigate their new borders. It's easy to forget now, but when these new borders were implemented after the war, it greatly affected families who were used to completely different lifestyles. Mexicans who were absorbed by the U.S. after the Mexican-American War suddenly found themselves citizens of a country they weren't even born in, and often didn't want them to begin with due to racism and bigotry. Future conflicts such as the Mexican Revolution from 1910 to 1920 would push more Mexicans into El Norte, as the U.S. is referred to by Mexicans even to this day. Situations like this are better described by Mexican immigrants themselves, such as Lucio Martinez, who once said, quote, "Nobody leaves their home country because they want to. Circumstances force one to leave to seek a better life for themselves and their families." End quote. Circumstances like searching for better economic opportunities, uncertainties during war, and religious persecution forced many Mexicans in the early 1900s to immigrate to El Norte. The railroads played a major role in getting Mexicans to various parts of the U.S. to find jobs. Countless Mexicans worked in southern border states such as Texas, California, Arizona, and New Mexico, mainly as agricultural workers. It was backbreaking work with low pay and no safety nets. If you got severely hurt, too bad, you were immediately replaced. Even so, competition for jobs in the southern states was so great that Mexicans had to look elsewhere. So Mexicans moved up further north for better economic opportunities, since other industries like the railroads offered not only jobs, but the opportunity to venture and even housing. Crappy housing, but housing nonetheless. The importance of the railroads for Mexican immigration to Chicago and the greater U.S. is often overlooked, but it is a critical piece of Chicago history. The railroads were so important for Mexican immigration to Chicago that they even built small communities with the railroad boxcars, known as boxcar communities. To understand this importance, I was lucky to find Ismael Cuevas, a community historian and curator for a current exhibition at the National Museum of Mexican Art called Reales y Raíces. We sat down for a discussion on the importance Mexican railroad workers had in Chicago and the U.S. as a whole.
We don't see the phenomenon of Mexican-American railroad workers in the Midwest until the early 1910s. So Chicago is the railroad hub of the country. And so, that common saying of all roads lead to Rome, all railroads lead to Chicago. From the West Coast to the East Coast, from the South to the North, Chicago is connected to Canada, to Mexico, and on both sides of the ocean, right? On both oceans. Now, Mexican workers, when they're getting recruited, they're not getting recruited to come specifically to work in Chicago. They're coming to work wherever there is jobs available. So constructing the railroad in America, obviously, America is such a massive country, right? So it took hundreds of thousands of laborers, millions across the country to build a network, right? And so these railroad encampments or these boxcar camps were basically a method that the railroad companies use to be able to house their employees. Now, what does become interesting about Mexican communities is that when you're following the railroad lines from Texas to the Midwest, all along the way you're going to find boxcar camp communities, and that's what makes the boxcar camp communities central to telling the Mexican-American story in the United States. Because you can go to Newton, Kansas, you can go to Dodge City, Kansas, you can go to in Texas, you can go to Missouri, you can go to Iowa. There's boxcar camps all across any line that was connected to Chicago from the Mexican-U.S. border. Literally had a boxcar camps along the way, because traqueros were, actually the word traquero comes from the word track, and we made it into the word traque, and then traquero comes from traque, right? So it's not a proper Spanish word. So a traquero is literally the person who's maintaining or the railroad itself, the actual ties, the maintenance of the railroad. And so you literally have these groups moving along the tracks, fixing the tracks as they're going along. And so some of these camps were, most of these camps were actually just temporary housing that was promised to workers. So what was really interesting about talking about the boxcar settlements is just daily life as well. So in that daily life, we talked about people were praying, people going to church, people getting married, baptisms, theater, right? The arts, yeah. Those are things that are really, really important to the foundation of Mexican community, because that's how you're carrying culture across time and space. One of the challenges that the museum gave us to curate this exhibit was how do we talk about women in the railroad? And so it's already hard looking for Latinas who are railroad workers, and it was going to be even harder to find Latinas Mexicanas who worked in the railroad here in the Midwest. But luckily, through our community outreach process, what we call the community call out, we use the museum's social media to ask the community, hey, if you have if you want to submit any photos of your ancestors who worked in the railroad, we'd like to review them and see if they're, we can put them in the exhibit. And we were contacted by a family in Fort Wayne, Indiana, who said, hey, our our mother worked in the railroads in Fort Wayne, Indiana. And I said, oh, that's awesome. Do you have any pictures? And sure enough, after a couple of weeks, they were able to locate a picture of Francisca Dimas Garcia from Fort Wayne, Indiana, working on the Nickel Plate Road, one of the railroad companies in Fort Wayne, as an engine wiper, basically maintenance for the locomotives. And so it was really awesome to see this mujer mexicana who was literally in this photo, wearing her railroad outfit. But then when we interviewed the family, we also found out that she was a civic leader in her community. She was one of the founders of the Our Lady Guadalupe Chapel in Fort Wayne, Indiana. She was also one of the founders of the Ballet Folklorico dance group in Fort Wayne. So it really shows you how these traqueros and traqueras were not just the workforce for the railroads, but they were also carving spaces for themselves and their Mexicano communities across the Midwest. One of the really beautiful contributions that our exhibit, Rieles y Raíces, makes to the canon of Chicago history was the discovery of boxcar communities in proper Chicago that had been previously untalked about had not been talked about. So this really cool discovery happened where we were able to find the 1930 census of a community in the far southeast side of Chicago, actually a small boxcar settlement of around 9 families living in between 2 railroad tracks, according to the U.S. Census. And then we've used some of the early aerial images of Chicago from 1938 to pinpoint if this boxcar camp existed. And sure enough, we were able to find it, the community on the satellite map. And in the third source, to kind of corroborate that we had done this correctly, we actually found one of the children who was living in that boxcar camp, who ended up becoming a Marine. His name is Richard Solano. Ended up becoming a Marine, ended up going to Northwestern University, and then ended up writing his own book. In his book, he talks about growing up in between two railroad tracks next to Lake Michigan. So we know that that's the boxcar camp that we discovered here in inner city Chicago. And we actually found examples of other boxcar camps across the Chicagoland area that were previously undisclosed or not registered in any of the databases that we have. And so that's a really cool contribution that we got to do as historians to Chicago Mexican history. It's a new history that hasn't been talked about, that hasn't been written about, or even on film. And so we're excited for the viewers to go check out that exhibit at the National Museum of Mexican Art. Boxcar camps ended up disappearing around the 1950s because sanitation issues, right? Better housing legislation that was protecting people from living in some of the substandard, subhuman housing. But for a couple of decades, that's where people were living.
In addition to the railroads, another labor program that greatly influenced Mexican immigration to the U.S. is the Bracero Labor Agreement of 1942, more commonly known as the Bracero Program. In simple terms, the Bracero Program was an agreement between the U.S. and Mexico to allow about 5 million Mexicans to work in mostly agriculture between 1942 and 1964, though a comparably small number also worked on the railroads. The Mexican workers who took on the Bracero Program and made the journey up north were promised many things: adequate living conditions, a minimum of 30 cents per hour, protection from the draft, and a requirement that a portion of their earnings would be put into the equivalent of a savings account, which was to be paid off at the end of their service. Unfortunately, few of these promises materialized. While the Bracero Program did make good on not drafting its Mexican workers to fight in World War II, Mexicans were frequently lowballed with their salaries, received subpar living spaces, and many never got the savings they were promised. To this day, it is estimated that the U.S. government owes Bracero workers over $500 million in savings payouts that were never given to them. The ominous presence of racism and bigotry was also a real risk many Mexicans faced, especially in the southern states. In fact, by 1943, the lynchings of numerous Mexicans who participated in the Bracero Program got so bad in the state of Texas that the Mexican government itself intervened and refused to send any more Mexican braceros for the remainder of the program. The Texas governor at the time, Coke Stevenson, pleaded with the Mexican government to give Texas a second chance and send Mexican workers again, but to no avail. Mexico was not playing around, and Mexicans, though desperate for work, were not suicidal. Many Mexicans who left Texas would eventually find their way to Chicago. Indeed, working as a bracero was dangerous, and not just because of the work. One of my friends has stories that were told to him by family members as his grandfather worked as a bracero. This is Tony Rebollar, a good friend and coworker. He graciously took some time out of his busy schedule to tell me about his family's connections to the Bracero Program, which ultimately led them to Chicago.
My grandfather, of my mom's side, growing up, he was stating, hey, there's no work. We have to provide for the family. Aquí no hay nada. There's nothing. We have to provide resources, income for the family. And we need to work. During that time, there was a whole tragedy happening around the world in the 1930s, 1940s, which we called the World War II. The people that were left without any employees to work their farms, their hospitals, were the American folk, the white folks, what we call it, you know. There was a lot of vacant jobs at farms, in the fields, at the hospitals, at nurses, and all these places, which the point that needed to be filled. In 1940s, the U.S. government lifted an act and put this act called the Bracero Act. Pretty much, it was a program where the U.S. was recruiting people from Mexico that worked in the farms, aka one of my grandpa was one of them. He saw the opportunity and he heard, not in the newspaper, he heard all the way in the south saying, hey, they're needing people up the north, what we call that El Norte, not the US, not los Estados Unidos, what we call it now, but El Norte.
El Norte.
Había oportunidades. There was opportunities in the north. He heard of that. He invested and took the risk of using whatever the resources he had to go up there and work. Luckily for my grandfather, he was able to make that trip from Guerrero all the way to California. Not sure how he did it, but I know he did a whole week transition, but transporting from Guerrero to California, it was a mission because you had to take the local railroads to just simply go up north. Back
then from Guerrero to California would take a week.
Even more. So from the small town my grandfather was from, to the local train station railroad, it's just 1 day travel in a horse. And from that part of where we're from in Guerrero, Iguala, you're able to take trains up north and move yourself all the way to the north. Long story short, my grandfather worked his time in California, Temecula area, San Juan Capistrano, California, which also is like a prestigious area in California, San Diego, where if you have money, you're able to live there and all that good stuff. So back in the days, that was all fields, farming fields, and people had no choice to work. Even though my family has been oppressed from the 1900s Mexican Revolution, even coming to the States, my grandfather saw oppression by not taking your land, but by, oh, you're Mexican, you're darker skinned than me, we don't care so much about you, we're gonna spray you with all these chemicals so you could be taking care of our lands. You know, now those chemicals, you're only supposed to put them in the hierbas, in the fruits of whatever's in the floor, and those liquids were only sprayed into those fruits. But the companies that were hiring these people were spraying them into the braceros, the workers. It's like you're putting all these chemicals, and that's how they saw all these oppressions with the Mexican folks. Like, okay, you're Mexican, yeah, we're gonna spray you. We pretty much don't care. You're not gonna be here for a while, so we're just gonna spray you with all these nasty chemicals, resulting sickness, cancer, and death to many of these Mexican workers.
The reason the railroads and the Bracero program were so important for Mexican immigration to Chicago is because it shows Mexicans did not come to Chicago in a straight line. Mexicans worked hard in border states and Midwestern states before finally settling in Chicago because the railroads, steel mills, and stockyards offered more stable work regardless of season. Chicago had industry, and that industry needed labor. The irony and hypocrisy of the U.S. demonizing and belittling Mexicans while at the same time needing Mexican labor, work, and money is not lost on those that know history. Today, people are rightfully shocked and appalled by the actions of ICE agents that racially profile any and all brown and black people, even when they are citizens of the United States. Such is the case of Dulce Consuelo Diaz, a U.S. citizen who was arrested by ICE, held captive for 25 days, and as of this writing, is still fighting deportation despite being born in the U.S. While this is all shocking, historically, it's nothing new. Sadly, Mexicans have always been scapegoated in the U.S., especially during times of economic hardship. In 1954, in the middle of the Bracero program, Operation Wetback, and yes, that was the official U.S. government name, was initiated to target Mexicans for deportation out of a moral panic due to the Red Scare and out of false claims that Mexican workers were taking jobs from other Americans. Mexican railroad workers and braceros were targeted for deportation, even if they were citizens. It didn't matter that Mexican workers sacrificed years of their lives to cultivate fields or build the railroad connections that allowed worldwide U.S. trade. racism and bigotry were powerful forces, especially for politicians in power. Once again, Ismael Cuevas explains how Mexican railroad workers suffered from indiscriminate violence and deportation even when Mexicans gave all they had to the U.S.
So in our exhibit in Reales y Raíces, we talk about the deportations, specifically during the Operation Wetback program, which is obviously a racial slur, targeting Mexicans across the river. And fast forward to the 1940s, World War II, again, we had the Bracero program. We were asking, the United States was asking Mexico for workers, and immediately after, a couple years later, then Operation Wetback starts in 1954. And again, it targeted primarily the Southwest, but Chicago was not an exception. Now, what is really central to this story as well is that physically where I am standing today, doing this interview with you, we're actually in what was the epicenter of the Operation Midway Blitz during the Trump campaign during the summer of 2025, where Trump and ICE are specifically targeting Mexicanos, or racially profiling people who they think are Latinos, and asking them for their papers and subsequently sending them to detention centers and deporting them. So in my history in this exhibit, I couldn't ignore that reality, my lived reality, where I am literally living in the neighborhoods that are getting targeted by the administration. So my exhibit obviously had to cover that. And so I am a fan of letting the record speak. And the record spoke. And the record spoke loud and clear. We actually talked to a family whose father, Alfonso Ayala, was a railroad worker who came during the 1930s and worked across different railroads here in Chicago, and was actually in 1953 or 1954 asked during the Operation Wetback to self-deport. And so he had just bought a house in 1948 in the Fuller Park neighborhood, a few blocks away from where we are. So imagine you are now chasing or following the American dream. You have your kids enrolled in school. You just bought a home with your money that you're making as a railroad worker in Chicago. You buy your house, and literally 6 years later, in 1954, you're deported. And in the exhibit, we literally have the letters. We used letters that the daughters were writing to him while he was in Mexico. And it's really sad when you're reading this, because you're reading these letters and it says, dear daddy, we miss you. We can't wait till you come back home. And it tells you that harsh reality that the Mexicanos had to face in different time periods in American history. We are wanted, they were not wanted. We're wanted and we're not wanted. So what we did in the exhibit is that we wanted the historical record to speak for itself and to show that history, one, repeats itself, but two, that there's a underlying hypocrisy when it comes to the workforce in this country, right? That we're literally being celebrated for coming here to work. We found a magazine that's in the exhibit from the Southern Pacific Railroad, where you see on the exhibit, it literally has workers with the American and the Mexican flag and the president of the railroad saying, we are happy to have Mexicanos coming here to work, right? And then a couple decades later, you have the American government and elected officials talking about fearing the Mexican invasion, right? Back in the 1950s. And so it's really hypocritical how this is happening in history. But then 70 years later, we are dealing with that exact same problem now, right? And it's a really stark and sometimes dark reminder of how history will repeat itself if it goes unchecked.
History indeed repeats itself if you don't take the time to learn from it. But thankfully, Mexican history and immigration in Chicago is not all doom and gloom. There are far more examples of Mexican triumphs in Chicago through culture, food, and people. It was to my amazing luck that during this video project, the Chicago History Museum had an exhibition about the Latino community in Chicago called Aquí en Chicago, which is Spanish for here in Chicago. While this temporary exhibition focuses on all Latino contributions to the city of Chicago, Mexicans make up a huge amount of Latino Chicago history. The exhibition reiterates what Ismael Cuevas and Tony Rebollar have said about Mexican workers coming to Chicago through the railroads and bracero programs, and adds how much Mexicans have grown culturally and professionally in the years since then. Yes, Mexicans did come to Chicago as railroad, farm, and factory workers, but in the generations afterwards, they have also grown to be so much more. Through the sacrifices of their parents and grandparents, Mexicans and Mexican Americans in Chicago are now doctors, nurses, lawyers, politicians, authors, and the list goes on. There are countless Mexican success stories in Chicago, each with their own unique struggles and triumphs, such as the Mexican American activist Rudy Lozano, who was essential in uniting the Black and Latino vote in 1983 to elect Harold Washington as mayor, Chicago's first African American mayor. Rudy Lozano himself ran for alderman in the 22nd Ward, which included Little Village, the neighborhood he grew up in. Though he lost by a narrow margin, Rudy Lozano kept fighting for the rights of Mexicans and other Latino communities in Chicago. He helped form unions in industries such as the garment industries and the tortilleria factories to improve conditions for workers. Sadly, it's believed that this fight for unionization against corrupt business owners is what ended Rudy Lozano's life, as he was gunned down outside his own home by a gang member whose motivations for killing Lozano are still debated today. A historical mark stands today outside the house Rudy Lozano was murdered, along with a plaque describing his life and commitment to the betterment of the Mexican and Latino communities in Chicago. While a tragic end, Rudy Lozano's life is also a reminder of Mexican triumph in Chicago. Rudy Lozano not only fought for the rights of unionization of the Chicago working class, but even organized students during his college days at the University of Illinois at Chicago for more courses on Mexican history and more Latino staff. While one story isn't representative of an entire community, personal stories still offer an insight to life in that community. With this in mind, I interviewed my cousin, Sandra Torres. We sat down at a Palestinian restaurant in Bridgeview, Illinois, to discuss her life as a Mexican American in Chicago.
So my dad's side of the family is the Mexican side. I'm Mexican and Salvadorian. But my dad's side of the family is from Guanajuato, so like central Mexico. So I remember as a kid, we did move around quite a bit, but where like I feel like I spent the most time was probably, I want to say, early 2000s was when my dad had gotten his promotion at work, and he had a union job. He was able to like financially, support us in a much more stable way, and so we ended up buying a house near 55th and Pulaski, which like that, I feel like any sort of neighborhood south, it wasn't trendy to have like names to it. So we all just, again, grid system, we went by street, intersections. So basically I was near the Pulaski Orange Line stop, 2 stops away from Midway Airport. Everyone was Mexican, everyone was low income, like we were all not the same, obviously everyone's experience is unique, but we were all kind of living through the same sort of environment. So in that portion, I didn't really struggle. I think where it became more challenging for me was actually when I went to high school. I was very academic, I was valedictorian, I was very good, and so I ended up getting into one of the selective enrollment schools in the city. I went to school in the north side, so I went to high school in Lincoln Park High School. That was like a hike for me. I had to take 2 trains to get there, it wasn't anywhere close to where I lived. And if people don't know the history of Chicago is a very segregated city, and so me going to high school was actually the first time that I was in an environment where I wasn't the majority. And it wasn't until I went to high school where I was in this very large public school, and even though it was still a public school, because of my curriculum and the program that I was doing, I was mostly surrounded by very mid to upper socioeconomic class of people, way less racially diverse. And so that is where not that my identity was challenged, but that my worldview of like identity expanded, because I was so, even though Chicago is a very diverse city, you're going to find a lot of different kinds of Latinos. By sheer volume of population, it is very much dominated by Mexicans. And then when I made the jump to college, that's probably where I was a little bit more challenged as well, because I, again, was put in an environment. I went to a very small liberal arts school in the middle of rural Iowa, not a ton of racial diversity. So there's just any environment where there's less of you, it's inevitable. You're being challenged in that way. And it was difficult, not as far as like an idea of belonging, but it was challenging for me in the way that I just didn't know how to define it, right? And it's your early 20s, you're figuring out who you are anyway, so there's a lot of other things happening in parallel. So I'm a trained microbiologist, and the first job I ever had out of school was actually as an applied scientist, where I worked for this company that sold lab instruments to quality control labs and manufacturing facilities. And basically, long story short, I helped staff develop protocols and test products, make sure they were safe before it was sold and distributed to the public. And they needed someone that was actually fluent in Spanish, because the territory was Latin America. And I feel like that's where really things came to a head as far as developing my racial identity. That's where I realized, being Mexican in the US and Chicago is not the same as a Mexican born in Mexico. But I got to see a much more expanded definition of what it meant to be Mexican. And it started to click in my head of the Mexicans I met in the US, now I understand the differences, right? Because a Mexican from Monterrey that immigrates to Chicago is going to have different sets of beliefs, different ways that they carry themselves than alguien de Oaxaca that goes to Chicago. Yes, they're technically both Mexicans, but they came from these different places within Mexico. Different demographic makeup. Oaxaca is in the peninsula. It's very heavily indigenous. It's very much connected to the land and the nature and the climate there. The border has its own very convoluted history. So people that come from there that go to immigrate to the US are going to come and show up differently. And so again, as far as identity, it wasn't until then where I got to see this much more expanded definition of identity. And at this point I've settled into I don't feel being Mexican or being Salvadorian or being a Chicagoan, being a one, it's all part of one, right? One doesn't exist without the other. I define it for myself. I don't let other people define it for me because it's my identity. And so, and even you could have another woman from Chicago with Mexican parents that will probably identify with different degrees of that. And it really is very, very personal.
The success stories of the Mexican community in Chicago can be seen in nearly all of its 77 neighborhoods. However, there are two neighborhoods in particular that are predominantly inhabited by Mexican and Mexican Americans since at least the 1950s: Little Village and Pilsen. Little Village is commonly known as La Villita even by Chicagoans that don't speak Spanish. During the summer, commercial and food vendors open for business in the streets, resembling how open markets work back in Mexico. 26th Street in Little Village stretches for nearly 2 miles, and it is a wealth of Mexican businesses such as this panaderia that sells a wide range of Mexican bread and sweets. And of course, you can't forget about Mexican restaurants, which are big business in Chicago. Mexican food is one of the most venerated cuisines in the world, and Chicago has some of the best Mexican restaurants outside of Mexico, thanks to Mexican immigrants bringing their recipes from the motherland. In Little Village, you'll be spoiled for options when it comes to food. Want a good Mexican breakfast? Go to La Catedral, a local favorite that serves chilaquiles, an extremely popular Mexican breakfast. Chilaquiles are tortilla chips that are smothered in a variety of Mexican sauces that come from different regions of Mexico. They are topped with fresh cheese, diced onion, and sour cream. You can add eggs, chicken, or skirt steak. Even the menu takes an entire page to educate people on the history of chilaquiles, as the word originated from the indigenous Nahuatl people. Chilaquiles also show the ingenuity of Mexican resourcefulness, as they were created as a way to repurpose stale tortilla chips so no food would go to waste. From this ingenuity, chilaquiles have become one of the most popular dishes in Mexican cuisine. Also in Little Village, you can go to Taqueria Atotonilco. Tacos are legendary by this point. Even if you never had Mexican food in your life, you know what a taco is. What people might not know is that tacos are a science. While the classic Mexican taco comes with cilantro, onion, spicy sauce, and lime, different regions of Mexico make their tacos in different ways. The tacos in Taqueria Atotonilco are served with carne asada, which is skirt steak, sour cream, and tomatoes. Not too far from Taqueria Atotonilco, you'll find El Milagro, which doubles as both a restaurant and Chicago's most famous tortilleria. The Mexican community in Chicago is so big that the need for tortillerias was palpable as early as the 1950s. For those that might not know, tortillerias are businesses that focus solely on the production of tortillas. El Milagro was so successful at providing high-quality tortillas that not only do they ship tortillas around the country, they also have their own successful restaurants. The tacos they make with their tortillas are one of a kind. You get 2 pieces of carne asada along with rice, beans, pickled cabbage, and spicy sauce. It's so rich with filling that they give you 2 tortillas to hold it all together. Now, it's important to note that El Milagro was recently part of major controversy. In 2021, many of its workers reported cases of abuse and poor treatment by the company's higher-ups, which was a source of great disappointment to the Mexican community, as many saw them as an example of Mexican pride in Chicago. Workers and their supporters took to the streets in protest against harsh working conditions, unreasonable hours, and sexual harassment. The response by the higher-ups at El Milagro did not help matters, as they initially acted defensively, gave excuses, and even threatened termination if their workers organized. While the workers of El Milagro eventually achieved higher pay and reasonable hours by 2022, the disappointment and shame of these revelations towards their own workers still lingers with El Milagro to this day. But Little Village isn't the only neighborhood with a strong Mexican presence. Coming in right behind is Pilsen. Before the 1950s, Pilsen was a neighborhood that was mainly inhabited by Polish, Slovak, Lithuanian, German, Irish, and Croatian immigrants. However, the 1950s saw a huge influx of Mexican immigrants that was fueled by the railroads, Bracero program, and Chicago's industrial jobs. While Pilsen is showing signs of gentrification with fancy apartments and coffee shops with unreasonably high prices, Mexican businesses are still in abundance. One of these businesses is El Anticuario, a family-owned vintage store that also doubles as a small bakery on the weekends. The store is owned by Alex Orozco, her husband Francisco, and daughter Gibby. Alex was gracious enough to sit down with me and talk about her business and how life in Chicago has been as a Mexican immigrant.
Soy originaria de Guadalajara, de la ciudad de Guadalajara, y nos venimos a Estados Unidos en 1993, el 94, a mediados de 1994. Y nos venimos porque mi esposo estaba estudiando y vino a estudiar su parte porque él estaba estudiando para capellán, pero no había esa carrera allá en México, o sea, como un doctorado en capellanía para el cuidado de los pacientes. A mi esposo siempre le ha gustado el arte, todo el tiempo, nunca tira nada. Siempre cuando se rompe algo, o lo encontraba que alguien lo tiraba, o alguien que le decía, tengo esto, pero no quiero tirarlo. Entonces él siempre buscaba la manera de cómo repararlo y que volviera otra vez a su estado original. A todo le halla el arte. Entonces empezó, antes no se llamaba el anticuario, se llamaba, lo hizo como con lo mismo de ayudar a la gente. Era en la parte norte de Chicago, estaba el negocio. Y se quedó, después cuando vendieron el edificio, empezó a buscar y encontramos a este lugar y fue cuando le cambió, en lugar de llamarse Chaplaincy, el hogar le puso anticuario, porque dice, pues tenemos muchas cosas que son antiguas, que son muy bonitas. Entonces nació en el 2014 con 2015.
Oh, wow.
La gente cuando entra siempre hacen como un wow, que, o sea, no se imaginan que hay algo aquí así. Piensan, no, porque no es como una tienda de segunda, pero son cosas que ya son usadas, sino que es más como arte. Y siento que eso es ver la gente cuando entra y la gente empieza a decir, ay, mira, lo tenía en la casa de mi abuela. Entonces trae como ese recuerdo que es muy bonito, ¿no? Recordar. Como hay muchas cosas que a la gente le da nostalgia de cosas que son de México, de la gente que se han traído cuando van en sus viajes o cuando iban en sus viajes y que traían recuerdos o que han comprado, pero ahora como los hijos son minimalistas, no quieren nada a veces de lo que está en las casas, entonces hay cosas que él ha coleccionado, pero otras cosas que hemos encontrado, que la gente cuando él se pone a limpiar las casas, él agarra esas cosas y dice, esto me gusta y esto. Y es su arte de él. Somos bien cafeteros y siempre a la hora como esto de las 4 a las 5 de la tarde, siempre andábamos buscando pan, donde encontrar pan y café. Entonces, pues a veces, como es cuando está el clima que no lo permite, entonces me traje mi cafetera y me traje el horno porque dije, pues si en la casa lo hago y aquí estamos la mayor parte del día, entonces me traje el horno y empecé a cocinar. Entonces la gente cuando llegaba decía, ay, que huele tan rico. Entonces les invitaba, pues quieres hice unas galletas y empezó así la gente, no quiero que me la des, véndemela. Entonces dije, pues si da la oportunidad, pues, ¿por qué no? Entonces nomás empecé a hacer pasteles y cafecitos, tecitos. Ya me gusta mucho hacerlo.
The owners of El Anticuario also own another store in Pilsen just across the street called El Cementerio, which is equally filled with awesome antiques and vintage items. But Pilsen's importance to the Mexican community expands further than its businesses. Pilsen is popular for its variety of Mexican murals, and they are everywhere. As an art form, Mexican murals can be traced back to the 1920s to the times of Diego Rivera. While Diego Rivera did not start the Mexican mural as an art form, he did popularize it, and that popularization of Mexican art made its way to Chicago, with Pilsen being the neighborhood where this art form shines the brightest. Every mural has history, emotion, and story. Whether it's murals celebrating Mexican revolutionaries like Pancho Villa, murals representing the sacrifices Mexicans have made with the backbreaking work they have done for the U.S., or murals simply representing Mexican pride. Every mural in Pilsen is unapologetically proud and radiating with dignity. Pilsen is also where you'll find the National Museum of Mexican Art. The museum is free of charge and showcases art from different periods in Mexico's history. From clay dolls that date back to the Aztec Empire to current paintings that represent the ongoing struggles in the Mexican community, the National Museum of Mexican Art is an open invitation to anyone in Chicago to delve deep into the meaning of Mexican art and culture. Especially now, where the continued persecution of Mexicans and other Latino communities is inescapable with how fast news travels through social media. Though art is used to express grief and hard times, it is also used to express joy and accomplishments. The art and history at the National Museum of Mexican Art reminds us that times were dark before, but people overcame. We fought back and won. And if we did it before, we'll do it again. Of course, I can't speak about Pilsen and not mention a few restaurants. And the first one I want to mention is Quesabirria Jalisco Tacos. Quesabirrias might look like they're just really thick tacos at first glance, but they are a completely different ballgame. Quesabirrias are a hugely popular dish thanks to their flavor, broth, which is called consomme in Spanish, and their ungodly amounts of Mexican cheese. Usually made with either beef or goat meat, it is seasoned and cooked in its own juices for several hours. Once the meat pulls apart easily, it is put in a tortilla along with generous amounts of gooey, delicious Mexican cheese, usually Chihuahua cheese. You can then add cilantro, onion, and any spicy sauce if you want. But wait, it's not over. Quesabirrias also come with a cup of the meat's own delicious broth in which you can dunk the quesabirria with every bite you take. The savory taste of the meat, the crunchiness of the tortilla, the melted cheese, and the addition of the broth makes quesabirrias simply magical. I also can't leave out Mexican sweets in this video, and Chicago has its own chain of Mexican ice cream stores called La Michoacana. Now, one thing to know about La Michoacana is that it's both an ice cream chain and a region in Mexico called Michoacán. In fact, in Mexico, the state of Michoacán make up a huge portion of the Mexicans that have immigrated to Chicago. The number of Mexicans that have come from Michoacán to Chicago is so great that even if all the Mexicans left Chicago, except for those that came from the state of Michoacán, Mexicans would still make the second biggest Latino community in Chicago. La Michoacana is a statement to the amount of Mexicans that have come specifically from Michoacán. La Michoacana serves all types of Mexican sweets, ice cream, paletas, and frozen yogurt. They also have a few savory snacks like Mexican corn or hot Cheetos with nacho cheese, a childhood favorite. My personal favorite is their strawberry yogurt with almonds, granola, bananas, and grapes. Highly recommend it. Now, I can't finish this video without visiting my personal favorite Mexican restaurant from my childhood neighborhood of Albany Park. The restaurant is Taqueria Morelia, and I've been coming here since I was 12 years old. It's the definition of a hole in the wall, a mom and pop place, a family-owned restaurant. While Taqueria Morelia might look like any other small Mexican restaurant in Chicago, this is my restaurant. It's where I grew up. It's one of the few restaurants I have a sense of loyalty to. Every time I visit, I always alternate between two dishes. In one visit, I eat a torta with a huaracha, and on the other visit, I eat their delicious chilaquiles. I already went into detail why chilaquiles are a Mexican breakfast staple, but I still need to get into tortas and huarachas. Tortas are my favorite Mexican food. I judge a Mexican restaurant based on how good their tortas are. Tortas are basically a Mexican sandwich, but even this description is limiting. Tortas are a small explosion of flavor. They are made with a bread called a bolillo and come with fried beans, sour cream, cheese, lettuce, tomatoes, avocado, and your choice of meat filling. My favorite is carne asada, of course. As for the huarache, think of it as a long fried tortilla with fried beans, cilantro, onions, cheese, and meat filling. My favorite being, again, carne asada. Not only that, but Taqueria Morelia makes their own spicy red and green sauce, and I love putting these sauces for that extra spice with every bite I take. Spicy? Yes. Delicious? Absolutely. With all that is happening right now, with all the brutality brought down on the Mexican and other communities nationally by our own government, it's important to remember that we've been here before, and more importantly, we overcame. No matter how hard federal or local governments have tried to minimize the contributions that Mexicans had on the country, the reality is, without Mexicans, the United States would not be the country that it is today. Chicago is a prime example for how Mexicans brought over their hard work, sacrifices, culture, food, and people to make the city one of the most recognizable cities in the U.S. From the lone Mexican man who sells tamales at my local laundromat in the middle of winter, to the doctors, politicians, and historians who continue to represent Mexico in Chicago, the Mexican spirit is alive, well, and growing. It will continue to grow because of its people. The Mexican spirit cannot be destroyed or broken. It can only grow and expand. Chicago is privileged to have Mexicans be an inseparable part of its history. And like George Lopez once said, we ain't going nowhere, eh? Thank you for watching. Viva Chicago. Y viva México, cabrones.